I've lived my time, she whispered. But the cowboy proved the night was hers again. Dust, like a mist, enveloped Oak Canyon, rising into the air with every step, every wheel that slowly turned on the main street. The air was heavy, saturated with the smell of damp hay, whiskey, and hopelessness. For Alara Vance, this dust was enough to fill the rest of her days. She didn't just live in it, she had become a part of it. Her face, etched with deep wrinkles, like maps of dried-up rivers, seemed to be molded from the same gray, lifeless dirt. The skin on her hands, cracked and coarse, resembled the bark of an old oak tree. Alara was a shadow. She moved through the town as if she wasn't there, as if she were merely a deceptive mirage that melts in the sun. Over the last 10 years, her life had turned into a monotonous, repetitive ritual. Every morning, with the first rays of the sun, she would leave her small shack on the outskirts and walk to the Dark Horse Saloon, where she worked as a dishwasher. She never looked people in the eye. Her gaze was always fixed downward. On the ground she walked, as if searching for something she had long lost, perhaps her youth, her energy, her place in this world. She was only 62 years old, but she felt 100. Years of hard work, loss, and loneliness had turned her into a shell. There were no longer any smiles on her face, only a rigid, lifeless mass. Her hair, once the color of wheat, was now dull, gray strands gathered in a messy bun. Her dress, faded and old, was always impeccably clean, which was her only pride. She worked, ate, slept, and waited for something that would never come. Or so she believed. Sometimes, while she washed dishes, her hands would freeze above the basin, and in the reflection of the water, she would see her face, the face of a stranger who was once alive. She would whisper to herself that her time was over, that all she had left was to live out her days until her dust mixed with the dust of Oak Canyon. That day, the Dark Horse was especially nosy. A gang of cattle rustlers, known as the Bloody Ravens, had arrived in town. They were loud, drunk, and dangerous. They threw money around, laughed, played cards, and looked down on the locals. Alara knew their type. She had seen people like them all her life. They always brought destruction with them, leaving only suffering and ruins in their wake. She just continued to work, her head bowed, trying to be invisible. Her job was simple: wash, dry, put away, and again, and again. But one of the ravens, a tall, bearded man named Buck with cruel eyes, noticed her. He was drunk and looking for someone to pick on. His gaze swept over her, and he laughed. "Hey, old hack, why are you so sour? Maybe you're missing something," he rasped, tipping his glass of beer. The mug fell to the floor and shattered, splashing Alara's leg. She flinched but didn't even raise her head. Grabbing a rag, she tried to wipe the floor, ignoring his taunts. This only angered Buck more. He moved closer and grabbed her shoulder, his fingers digging into the fabric of her dress like claws. "I'm talking to you, you rotten old woman." His voice was full of contempt, and that contempt was directed not only at her but at her very life, her silent existence. He was a symbol of everything she hated: cruelty, senseless aggression. But instead of answering, she froze, her head down. In that moment, she felt no fear, only emptiness, as if her body was just a vessel, and her soul had long since left it. She was so sure that her life was over that she didn't even see the point in fighting. At that moment, a man whom Alara hadn't noticed before appeared in the saloon doorway. His name was Silas Thorne. He was a cowboy, but not the kind who yelled and waved a revolver. His movements were calm and measured, like the flow of a large river. He was tall, with broad shoulders and narrow hips. His figure was lean but strong, like that of a predator who never makes a wasted move. His face, tanned and weathered, had a week's growth of stubble, and his eyes the color of old, faded denim were intelligent and penetrating. They saw more than they showed. He was dressed in a worn but clean leather jacket that looked like a second skin and a pair of well-used jeans. His hands were long and sinewy, and his palms showed calluses from work. He watched the scene from his spot at the bar, not saying a word, but his gaze was fixed on Alara. He didn't see an old woman. He saw the pain that was hidden so deep it had become a part of her. When Buck roughly jerked Alara's shoulder, the basin with water and dirty foam remnants fell from her hand, splashing everywhere on the floor, right at Buck's feet. He roared with fury. He raised his hand, ready to strike a blow that would likely be the final insult in her already worthless life. And then, finally, Silas's voice rang out. Not loud, not shouting, but low and calm, which, nevertheless, made everyone fall silent. "Maybe you should leave the old lady alone, pal," he said, It wasn't a demand or a request. It was a statement. There was no aggression in it, but there was such certainty that even Buck, in his drunken stupor, froze. "This doesn't concern you, Cowboy," Buck growled, not letting go of Alara. "This is just an old..." But he didn't get to finish. Silas slowly placed his glass on the counter, and that quiet sound was louder than any scream. He took a step forward, his movements so smooth that he seemed to glide across the floor. "Listen," Silas said, his voice even quieter. "I just want a drink. And I don't want to see a person who hasn't done anything to you get hit." There was such an unshakable, calm strength in this that it worked better than any threat. Buck, feeling the gazes of the other patrons on him, angrily pushed Alara away. She fell, her back hitting the edge of a wooden bench, and she cried out in pain. Buck laughed, and then, after throwing a hateful glance at Silas, returned to his friends. No one moved to help Alara. No one looked in her direction. It seemed they didn't care if she was alive or not. Everyone went back to their business, as if nothing had happened. Alara remained lying on the floor, feeling a sharp pain in her back, but the pain in her soul was much stronger. The pain of contempt, the pain that her life was worth nothing. At that moment, she finally believed that her time was truly over. She closed her eyes. She didn't want anyone to see her tears. But just as she was ready to sink into darkness, a shadow fell upon her. Someone knelt down beside her. It was Silas. He didn't try to help her up or say trite words of comfort. He just reached out and gently brushed a strand of gray hair from her face that had stuck to her sweat-dampened skin. There was no pity in his touch, only genuine, deep compassion. "Sometimes," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "it seems like everything is lost. But it's not." Alara opened her eyes and, for the first time in many years, looked a person in the face. And in his eyes, the color of old denim, she saw something that made her heart, which had seemed to stop, beat again. She saw not pity, but recognition. Recognition of her pain, of the strength she had long forgotten. In that moment, as she lay on the dirty floor, and the world around her was full of indifference, she felt herself to be more than just a shadow. She felt seen. And that was the beginning. But the beginning of what? She didn't know yet. She only knew that for the first time in many years, she wanted to live again. A new, unbearable weight settled on Alara's shoulders, a weight not from work or fatigue, but from those 2 coins in her pocket. They burned her, a reminder of a fleeting moment of human warmth she wasn't ready for. She held them so tightly, as if they were the only thing keeping her from falling off the edge of a cliff. The next morning was the same as all the others. Gray, dusty, and indifferent. Alara, however, for the first time in a long while, didn't want to go to work. She was afraid to face Silas again, with his quiet understanding and eyes that saw right through her. She was afraid he would ask her about something that would force her to open old wounds she had so carefully hidden. Her thoughts were chaotic. She couldn't forget his touch, his words about dignity. How could he see dignity in her? In a woman who lived like a ghost, hiding from the world and from herself. When she finally made up her mind to leave the house, her body moved slowly, as if it were a stranger's. She approached her shack, and her gaze fell on an old, rusty sign that had once hung above the entrance. Vance & Sons, Forge and Repair. It was almost illegible under a thick layer of dust and rust. Memories washed over her with such force that she stumbled. Many years ago, when her husband, Jonathan Vance, was still alive, that sign had shined. He was the best blacksmith in the whole region. His hands could forge anything from a horseshoe to an elegant ring. Their forge was the heart of the town. People came to them not only for work but for advice, for a kind word. Jonathan was a strong but kind man, and Alara, his wife, was his support. She managed all the business, took care of the household, and raised their 2 sons, James and Samuel. Their life was filled with work, but also laughter and joy. They were a family, a true one, as strong as the steel Jonathan forged. But then everything changed. Uninvited guests came to town. A gang called the Rippers, led by the cold-blooded and ruthless Spencer Black. They weren't like the Bloody Ravens. They were quiet and deadly, like snakes. They didn't rob for money but simply sowed fear, taking everything they liked, leaving nothing but ashes and pain. Jonathan, who always stood on the side of justice, stood up for his neighbors, refusing to forge weapons for them. He knew what he was doing. He knew he was signing his own death warrant. He was brave. And Alara was just his wife. That day, Spencer came to the ranch. There were no screams, no gunshots. There was only silence, which later turned into a deafening roar. Jonathan and their eldest son, James, died that day. Alara and their younger son, Samuel, hid in the cellar, hearing the cries of her husband and son, but unable to help them. This memory was the darkest place in her soul. She touched the rusty sign, and her fingers felt the cold of the metal, as if she was touching her own past. She was different back then. She was Alara Vance, the blacksmith's wife. Now she was just Alara, a shadow, with no family, no home, no past. After the death of her husband and son, she lost everything. The business fell apart. Samuel, her only remaining son, ran away, unable to cope with the grief and horror. She tried to hold him, but he was too young, too scared. He just disappeared. And since then, she had been waiting for his return. But the years passed, and hope grew dimmer. She had stopped believing in the future because the past had destroyed her. And now, after so many years, this stranger, Silas Thorne, had brought her these 2 coins. 2 coins that were more than just money. They were hope, and she didn't know what to do with it. When she arrived at the saloon, she saw him. Silas was sitting at the bar, calmly sipping whiskey. She couldn't take her eyes off him. She expected him to notice her, to ask her about something, but he did none of that. He was just there, his calm presence a kind of protection. Alara began her work. She washed glasses, wiped the counter, moving slowly, trying to stretch out time. She wanted to understand what to do with this feeling he had awakened in her, a feeling that was a mixture of gratitude, shame, and a burning fear. At some point, Silas turned and saw her. He slowly put his glass down and walked over to her. Alara froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She squeezed the rag in her hand. "I know who you are, Alara," he said, his voice quiet. "I heard about the Vances, about the blacksmith, who wasn't afraid to stand up to Spencer Black." Alara paled. She didn't know what to say. Those words were like a slap in the face. Her past, which she had so carefully hidden, was out in the open. "But I don't know what happened to that brave man," he continued. "And I don't know what happened to the strong woman you were." These words were not filled with reproach, but with sadness. And that was the worst part. She wanted to run, to hide, so that no one would see her again. But Silas kept talking. "Spencer Black, I know who he is, and I know what he did." Alara froze. She couldn't breathe. How could he know? She hadn't told anyone. It was her most terrible secret, her personal hell in which she had lived all these years. He looked at her with the same calm understanding he had looked at her with yesterday, and she saw that he didn't just know. He felt her pain, her suffering. He didn't know the details, but he knew the main thing, that her past hadn't let her go. And that realization scared her more than Buck's words. "I know," he said again, as if she hadn't heard him. "I'm not just here for nothing. I'm looking for him." Alara felt her knees give way. She looked at him, and in her eyes, for the first time in many years, a fire appeared. It wasn't the fire of hatred or rage, but the fire of fear. "Why?" she rasped. "Why are you looking for him?" Silas didn't answer. He just stood there and looked at her. He wasn't going to explain anything. And in that moment, she realized that he wasn't just a cowboy who had helped an old woman. He was a man who had his own scores to settle with the past and was willing to do anything to settle them. And she, without knowing it, had been drawn into his game. A game that could cost her the last thing she had left, her life. The flash of fear frozen in Alara's eyes quickly changed into something else, a hot, burning rage that was so unexpected it almost suffocated her. Rage not at Silas, but at herself, at her weakness, at her life that had turned into a miserable existence. Spencer Black, that name was not just a name, it was a synonym for pain, horror, the end of everything that was dear to her. And now, after so many years, it had sounded again, spoken by this cowboy who seemed to see right through her. "You don't know what you're talking about," Alara hissed, her voice low and trembling with tension. She turned away, unable to look him in the eyes anymore. "You don't know anything about him." "I know enough," Silas answered calmly. "I know he's destroying more lives than he's built, and I know he's hiding." "And what are you going to do?" she asked sarcastically, not turning away. "Become a sheriff, get revenge. You're just one man. He's like a ghost. No one can find him." Silas moved closer, his shadow covering her. He didn't speak, just stood, giving her a chance to vent her rage, but his presence was so strong that Alara felt small and insignificant. When her anger subsided a little, he spoke again. His voice was quiet, but there was a firmness in it that left no doubt. "I have information that no one else has, and I came here to find it." There's a person here who knows where he is. A person who was with him but ran away. A frantic rhythm pounded in Alara's heart. She felt a chill run through her body, not from fear, but from a dawning realization. She looked at him, and in her eyes was a mix of horror and disbelief. "Who?" she whispered. Silas didn't answer, but in his eyes, she read everything she needed to know. Her son, her Samuel. He was with them. He was in the gang that destroyed her life. It was as if she had been pierced by an electric shock. It was too much, too incredible to be true. But she saw that Silas wasn't lying. There was no deceit or cunning in his eyes, only the truth. A cruel, merciless truth. For a moment, she felt as if she had been left alone again, as if the whole world had conspired against her. Her husband and eldest son had died, and her youngest had become one of the people who killed them. She couldn't bear it. She wanted to scream, to run away, to escape from this reality, from this man who had brought her not hope, but even more pain. She grabbed a glass that was on the counter and threw it against the wall. It shattered into 1,000 shards, the sound loud and sharp, but no one in the saloon paid any attention. They were too busy with their own business, their own conversations. Alara screamed, not from pain, but from despair. Despair that had overwhelmed her. She felt as if the ground was giving way beneath her feet. Everything she believed in, everything she knew, everything she thought about her son, was a lie. She wanted to die, to just disappear so she wouldn't feel this pain anymore. But Silas didn't back down. He slowly but surely walked over to her, and his hand rested on her shoulder. The touch was firm and reassuring, and it was filled not with pity, but with strength. "Your son wasn't like them," he said quietly, his voice so calm it seemed like an oasis in the raging chaos of her emotions. "He was still a boy, and he knew what they did. He ran away from them, but he knows where Spencer is, and he's the only one who can lead us to him." Alara sank to her knees, her strength gone. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed. Hot tears streamed down her cheeks, burning her skin. These were tears of despair, tears of disappointment, tears of fear. But amidst those tears was something else, something that was starting to ignite in her soul, a small but bright spark. It was rage. Rage at Spencer Black, who had destroyed her family. Rage at herself, for hiding for so long. And, most importantly, rage for her son, for what he had endured and gone through. This rage was so strong that it pushed out all the pain and despair. She lifted her head. Her eyes were red, and her face was wet with tears. "You're lying," she rasped, her voice like the snarl of a predator. "My son was never with them." "I'm not lying, Alara," Silas said. "I'll tell you everything, but not here. Let's meet tonight, at the bridge, outside of town." He turned and left, leaving her alone, on her knees, in a puddle of water and broken glass. She watched him go, and in her eyes, there was no longer fear or despair. There was only a fire that was growing stronger and stronger, consuming everything in its path. The fire of revenge. A fire that made her remember who she really was and that she was capable of fighting. She stood up, her body no longer feeling the pain. She felt that the old fire, which she thought had long since gone out, had finally reignited in her heart. A fire that she needed to find her son, and to put an end to the man who had destroyed her life. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew that she couldn't live as a shadow anymore. She had to act, and she would act. She looked up at the sky, and for the first time in many years, she saw not a gray, lifeless sky, but stars that shone so brightly they seemed to be calling out to her. When Alara arrived at the old wooden bridge outside of town, night had already completely fallen on Oak Canyon. The air was cold, saturated with the smell of damp leaves and wet earth. The river under the bridge quietly whispered its eternal stories, its waters gleaming in the light of the full moon. Alara was nervous, her heart beating in her chest like a captured bird. She had come not because she trusted Silas, but because she was driven by a blind rage. A rage that had become her fuel. A rage that had awakened her from a long sleep. She waited to learn the whole truth about her son, which she hoped would not be as terrible as Silas had painted it. Soon, a silhouette emerged from the darkness. It was Silas. He walked towards her slowly, his steps inaudible on the wooden planks of the bridge. He stopped a few feet away from her, his face barely visible in the darkness. "You came," he simply said. There was no surprise in his voice, as if he was absolutely certain she would. "Tell me," Alara demanded, her voice firm and devoid of emotion. "Tell me everything." Silas nodded, He leaned against the bridge railing and began to speak, his voice quiet, like the whisper of the wine, but every word was weighty. He told her about Spencer Black, who wasn't an ordinary bandit. He was a man who believed in his own rules, in his own twisted sense of justice. He didn't rob for money, but for power and control. He recruited young, frightened boys into his gang who had no one to protect them. He gave them power, and in return, he took their souls. I grew up in the area where he operated, Silas continued. My father was one of those who tried to stand up to him. He was a sheriff, a man of honor. Spencer destroyed his life, as he did thousands of others. I witnessed how he picked up boys like your son, kids who were too scared to fight and too desperate to give up. Alara felt her anger intensify. The hatred for Spencer Black was no longer just abstract, it had a name, a face, and a purpose. It was almost tangible. She wanted to tear him to pieces. She wanted him to suffer the way she had suffered all these years. But next to this anger was something else, a deep, painful pity for her son, for the little boy who had endured such horror. But my son, he couldn't have, she began. But Silas cut her off. He wasn't like them. He was scared. I know he ran away. He was wounded, but he left. He knew that if he stayed, he would become just like them. He knew they killed your husband and son, and he couldn't live with that. Alara felt tears stream down her cheeks. These weren't tears of despair, but of relief. Her son wasn't a monster. He was a victim of circumstance, a victim of Spencer Black. This realization was the strongest catalyst. Her pain didn't disappear, but it transformed into something else, into determination. She no longer wanted to hide. She wanted to fight. So why are you telling me all this? She asked. What do you want? I'm looking for Spencer Black, Silas said, and your son is the only one who can lead me to him. He left a trail. I found it. But I need help. Mine. She scoffed. I'm just an old dishwasher. No. He firmly countered. You're a woman who survived hell. You're a mother who didn't give up. You are Alara Vance, and I am Silas Storm, and we have a long-standing score to settle with him. Together, we can find him. These words were so absurd she almost laughed, but she looked at his face, and there wasn't a hint of doubt in his eyes. He believed in her, believed in a strength she had long forgotten, and in that moment, as she stood on the old bridge, she felt her soul, which had seemed to have died long ago, come back to life. What do I need to do? She asked, and her voice was no longer that of a tired, old woman. It was the voice of a woman who had found her way again. I'm looking for my son, she said. I have to find him. And you will find him, Silas replied. But first, we must find Spencer. He won't stop until he finds your son, who knows all his secrets. Alara nodded. She finally understood. She didn't just want revenge. She wanted to save her son, and she was ready for anything. Absolutely anything. What do we do? She asked. We follow the trail, he said. A trail that leads us north. And on this journey, you'll have to remember how strong you once were, because there will be many dangers ahead, and you'll need to become the person you used to be again. Alara looked at her hands, which were rough and cracked, but now they didn't seem ugly to her. They seemed strong. She raised her head and looked at Silas. His calm gaze gave her strength. She felt alive, for the first time in many years, and she knew that this night would be the beginning of a new path, full of dangers, but also full of hope. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew she would no longer hide. She would fight, for herself, for her son, and for her life, which she had long considered over. The next morning dawned for Alara in a way completely different from all the previous ones. She didn't wake up from a dull ache in her body, but from a new, tingling sensation that felt like anticipation. Clutched in her hand was a small canvas pouch holding 2 coins. These coins, once a symbol of her humiliation, were now a symbol of her new path. She didn't know what awaited her, but she knew she wouldn't return to the saloon. She had left her old life behind. When she left the house, Silas was waiting for her. He stood by his horse, his face calm and focused. In his hands, he held a second horse, sturdy and resilient. She carry your things, he said, handing her the reins. We need to move fast. Alara nodded. She didn't know what to take, so she brought only the essentials, a change of clothes, a few hardtack biscuits, and a bottle of water. She didn't need much. Her life had taught her to get by with little. When she mounted the horse, she felt clumsy. She hadn't ridden since Jonathan was alive, but, as if by old memory, her body recalled how to hold on in the saddle, how to behave with the horse. She felt as if her body which she had so long despised, had found a new purpose. They headed north, and Oak Canyon slowly faded behind them. Alara didn't look back. She didn't want to. She had left behind her pain, her loneliness, and her past. She looked ahead, at the road that led them to a new, unknown life. They rode in silence. Alara didn't know what to talk about with this man. He was a mystery. He was her savior. Yet at the same time, he was her worst nightmare. He was the man who had brought her the truth that had shattered her. But she also understood that this truth was necessary. It was the very truth that had set her free. Days turned into nights, and they continued their journey. Alara was surprised by her endurance. She thought she would be weak, that she wouldn't be able to withstand such a journey. But she could. Her body, which she had so long considered broken, turned out to be strong. She rode alongside Silas, and they gradually grew accustomed to each other. They didn't talk about much, but their silence was filled with respect. Silas didn't treat her like an old woman. He treated her as an equal, and that was what gave her strength. They crossed several towns, but didn't linger in them. Silas didn't want to attract attention. He was cautious, constantly watching what was happening around them. He was like a predator stalking his prey, and Alara felt it. She didn't know what would happen next, but she trusted him. She couldn't explain why, but she trusted him. He was her only hope. One evening, they stopped by a river to make camp. Silas built a fire, and they sat by the fire, looking at the stars. Alara took out the hardtack biscuits and offered him one. He took it, and their fingers touched again and again. That electric jolt shot through her. This time, she didn't pull her hand away. She looked at his face, which was illuminated by the flames. She saw in him not just strength, but also weariness, and pain, and something else, something that was familiar to her. Loss. You lost someone, she said. And her voice was quiet. It wasn't a question, but a statement. Silas nodded, his gaze fixed on the fire. My family, he said. They were a part of my past. And Spencer Black took them from me. Alara felt her heart clench. She knew that pain. She knew what it was like to lose everything you love. And in that moment, as they sat by the fire, looking at the stars, they weren't just two strangers traveling together. They were two people united by the same pain. You're not just looking for him because of your son, she said. And it was a statement. You're looking for him to get revenge. Revenge is what drives me, he admitted honestly. But I'm also seeking justice. And your son is the key to it. He's the only one who can lead me to him. Alara was silent. She thought about her son, about the boy who had been forced to go through hell. And she realized that she had more than one reason to keep going. She had two reasons. She had to find her son, and she had to help this man. She reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder. He flinched, but didn't move his hand away. We'll find them, she said softly. We'll find Spencer Black, and we'll find my son. Together. Silas nodded. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw something that made her heart beat faster. Something that looked like hope. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone on his journey. And for the first time in a long time, Alara wasn't alone in her life. She was part of something bigger than herself. And that feeling was so strong that she felt the old fire in her soul, which had been burning all this time, turn into a new, stronger, brighter fire. A fire that wasn't just a fire of revenge, but a fire of a new beginning. The path north, which had begun as a race against time, became something more for Alara. It was a journey into her own past, which, as it turned out, wasn't just a series of misfortunes, but a lesson that had made her stronger. Silas became her guide not only in the physical world but also in her inner one. He didn't try to comfort her, didn't say trite words. He was simply there, and that was what was most important to her. His presence was a quiet but strong support, and she felt her old wounds, which she had thought would never heal, slowly begin to close. They crossed the state line, leaving familiar landscapes behind. The cold wind that blew from the north was sharp and piercing. But Alara didn't feel its coldness. She felt the warmth that came from her new sense of purpose. They followed the trail that, as Silas said, her son had left. These were small clue signs carved on trees, belongings left in abandoned cabins. They were barely noticeable, but Silas, like an experienced tracker, noticed them. Each such sign was like a small but firm step toward her son. For Alara, she began to believe. She began to believe that her son was alive, and that he was waiting for her. One day, they stopped at an old, abandoned shack in the woods. Silas dismounted his horse and approached the house. He carefully inspected it, his gaze sweeping over the walls, the porch, the windows. Alara, who was waiting for him at a distance, saw him freeze, as if he had sensed something. He returned to her and handed her a small piece of cloth. It was a piece of her old shirt that she had left in a house when her son had left. It was stained with blood. Alara felt her heart clench. He was wounded, Silas said quietly. But he left. Alara was silent. She pressed the piece of cloth to her chest, and tears welled up in her eyes. But they were not tears of despair, but of relief. Her son was alive. He was wounded, but he had left. He had escaped. He was strong enough to escape from them, and that realization gave her a new surge of strength. She felt as if her heart, which she thought had long been stone, began to beat again. "I have to find him," she whispered. "I have to find him." "We'll find him," Silas replied, "but we have to be careful. Spencer Black is also looking for him, and he's much closer than we think." And he was right. A few days later, when they stopped for the night, Silas heard something. He quickly extinguished the fire and ordered Alara to hide. Alara, without hesitation, did what he said. She hid behind a bush, crouching in the shadows, and watched him. She saw him pull out his revolver, his face tense and focused. She didn't know who it was, but she knew it wasn't a good sign. Two men emerged from the darkness. Their faces were hidden in the shadows, but she could see their silhouettes. They were armed and seemed to be looking for someone. They were talking to each other. Alara couldn't hear what they were saying, but she heard their names, Samuel and Spencer. These were Spencer Black's men. They were looking for her son. Alara felt her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to rush out and scream. She wanted to fight. She wanted to protect her son, but she knew she couldn't. She was too weak. She watched as Silas, who was invisible in the darkness, watched them. He was like a ghost. He was like a shadow. He was someone who was always ready for a fight. And that was what gave her strength. She knew he wouldn't let them harm her son. He was her last hope. Suddenly, one of the men stopped. He looked in the direction where Alara was hiding, and her heart froze. He said something to his companion, and they both moved toward her. Alara held her breath. She didn't know what to do. She was ready to die, but she didn't want her son to lose his mother again. Suddenly, Silas darted out of the darkness. He was like a whirlwind. He was like a hurricane. He was fast and deadly. He fired, and one of the men fell. The other, scared and disoriented, tried to run away, but Silas shot him in the leg. He fell, and Silas approached him. He was merciless. Alara saw him interrogating him, but she couldn't hear what they were saying. She only saw him take out his knife, and her heart froze. But he didn't kill him. He just hurt him. He made him talk. When he returned, his face was pale. He looked at Alara, and in his eyes, she saw something that made her heart clench. "They found him," he said quietly. "They found his trail. And they know he's in town. In the town where he grew up. In Oak Canyon." Alara felt her body go limp. She couldn't believe it. Her son, who had been hiding for so long, who had been running away for so long, had returned home. Returned to the place that was his home. And returned to the place where Spencer Black had ruined his life. She looked at Silas, and her eyes were filled with horror. "We have to go back," she whispered. "We have to go back and find him." Silas nodded. He knew they had to go back. He knew that the most dangerous part of their journey awaited them, but he also knew that they couldn't give up. They had to fight. For her son. For their lives. For their future. They quickly saddled their horses and started on the return journey. This time, they weren't riding. They were flying. They didn't feel tired, or cold, or hungry. They felt only one thing: the adrenaline that was driving them forward. They were riding toward their past. And they were riding toward their future. And she knew that this time, she wouldn't hide. She would fight. The return journey was not just long. It was filled with impatience and fear. Every step of the horse brought Alara closer to her past and to her son, who, it seemed, was waiting for her in the very lair of the nightmare that had once ruined their life. They didn't stop to rest, riding day and night, eating what they found along the way. Silas was tireless. His determination was so strong that it involuntarily passed on to Alara. Her body, which seemed to have exhausted all its strength, was filled with adrenaline that drove her forward. She was no longer an old woman. She was a mother returning home to save her child. They arrived in Oak Canyon under the cover of night. The town was quiet and serene. Nothing suggested the horror that might be hiding in its shadows. Silas ordered Alara to hide, and he went to scout ahead. He was a shadow that slid through the streets, listening to every rustle, peering into every window. Alara waited for him, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. She didn't know what would happen next, but she was ready. She was ready for anything. When he returned, his face was tense. "They're in the saloon," he said quietly. "Spencer Black and his men. They've taken the saloon owner hostage." Alara felt her body turn to stone. Rage boiled inside her, but it wasn't blind. It was calculated and cold. She knew she couldn't just storm in. She had to be smart. She had to be cunning. "What do we do?" she whispered. "I'll go in there," Silas said. "You, no," she firmly countered. "I'm going with you. This is my son, and this is my past. I have to be there." Silas looked at her, and there was no surprise or argument in his eyes. He saw the determination burning in her eyes, and he knew she wouldn't back down. He just nodded. "I have a plan," he said. "They're not expecting an attack. They're waiting for their accomplice. We have to surprise them." They agreed on how they would proceed and slowly moved toward the saloon. Alara, who was once just a dishwasher, was now part of a plan that could cost her her life. She didn't think about it. She thought about her son. She thought about her husband and elder son who had died. She thought about the justice she had been waiting for all these years. They entered the saloon. It was full. But it wasn't a nosy and cheerful saloon. It was a saloon filled with fear. Spencer Black sat at a table, his face cruel, a cold fire burning in his eyes. He was surrounded by his men, and, just as Silas had said, it had taken the saloon owner, an old man Alara had known all her life, hostage. "I came for you, Spencer," Silas said quietly. Everyone in the saloon froze. Spencer Black's gaze swept over Silas. A smile appeared on his face. Well, who have we here?" he said mockingly. "Is the sheriff's son trying to play the hero?" Silas didn't answer. He just stared at him. And in that moment, when everyone was distracted by Silas, Alara began to act. She quietly approached the bar. She remembered where the revolver that the saloon owner always kept under the counter was. Her hands were quick. She grabbed it. At that moment, one of the bandits noticed her. "Hey, Spencer," he yelled. "Old." But he didn't get to finish. Alara fired. Her hand didn't tremble. She shot him in the leg. He fell, his scream filling the saloon. Everyone turned to her. Spencer Black, who was so confident in his invulnerability, was surprised. His eyes widened. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected that an old dishwasher could terrify him. Silas took advantage of the moment. He pulled out his revolver and fired. It wasn't a chaotic fight. It was a fight between two men who knew how to kill. Silas was fast. He was accurate. He was ruthless. He shot them in the legs and arms, not to kill, but to disable. And Alara shot to protect. She shot to get revenge. She shot to end this game. And then she saw him, her son, Samuel. He was in the saloon, a hostage, huddled in a corner, his face pale and scared. He was wounded, but he was alive. His eyes were full of horror, but there was also a spark of hope in them. He saw her, and her eyes, which had been so empty for so long, filled with tears. They were tears of happiness, tears of relief, tears that said she had found him. Spencer Black, realizing he had lost, tried to escape. He grabbed one of his men and used him as a human shield. He tried to get to the door, but Silas, who was faster, stood in his way. They looked at each other, and in their eyes was the entire history that connected them. "You lost, Spencer," Silas said. "I never lose," Spencer smirked. "I always." But he didn't get to finish. Alara, who hadn't taken her eyes off him, fired. She shot him in the head. She was precise, and she was ruthless. Spencer Black fell. His body collapsed to the floor, and his eyes, which were full of hatred, went dark. Silence fell in the saloon, a silence filled with relief. Silas looked at Alara, and there was no judgment or surprise in his eyes. There was only respect. He saw what she had done. He saw that she had won. "We found him," he said quietly. "And you saved him." Alara nodded. She walked up to her son. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw everything she needed to know. He was scared, but he was alive. He reached out his hand to her, and she took it. She held him close, and in that moment, as she hugged her son, she felt her old wounds, which she had thought would never heal, finally close. Silas walked up to them. He placed a hand on Alara's shoulder. "Now you are free," he said, "and you can start living again." Alara looked at him, and there was gratitude in her eyes. She knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a new life, the beginning of a new story, a story that was written not by pain and suffering, but by courage, determination, and love. She turned to her son, and a new, bright fire burned in her eyes, a fire that was not just a fire, but a new, radiant light that illuminated their new path.